One of the things we need to reckon with is that if we want to change some of the inequities that women are so angry about, we have to sort of settle in and be prepared to stay angry for a long time, because there's an enormous amount of work to do.
Welcome to the Contrary. I'm Bonnie Bay. Good and Mad, the revolutionary power of women's anger. That's the title of Rebecca Traister's new book about the history of women's anger as political fuel. She joins us now. Has there ever been a time in American history when women's anger was so focused on the president?
On the president, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think that there are comparable moments within activism in which there has been, active and angry focus on the president. There were periods, especially toward the end of the suffrage campaign in advance of the passage and ratification of the 19th Amendment, where there was tremendous anger at Woodrow Wilson, and some of the stuff that some suffragist activists were doing was burning Wilson's speeches and things like that.
And also getting arrested for the first time.
Yes, yeah. So I think that there have certainly, there were frustrations during periods of the civil rights movement. But no, this kind of, the focus on the president and his disdain for women and their stories and their value, I think that this is a particular set of political circumstances that is a signature of the Trump era, and that, of course, was in play to some degree before he was elected, when there was such anger in the aftermath of the release of the Access Hollywood tape, and there was a sort of period of a preview of what would later become the hashtag #MeToo movement in the fall of 2017, when women took to social media and told their stories of being groped or assaulted, and women came out and told their stories of Donald Trump assaulting them on the record. And then, of course, he won the election. And he didn't win the popular vote. He won thanks to the Electoral College, but it is also true that despite this enormous show of fury from women in advance of that win, 53% of white women did vote for him. So, which called into question, how broad is the anger? Is it powerful enough to persuade white women to not support a man who shows open disdain and disrespect for them and their autonomy, their bodily autonomy? And that's a question I think that we've been looking for answers to ever since. Is the anger, which is loud and mass, and I view as politically consequential, how many women are going to be drawn into it and into a critique of Trump in a way that affects their votes? And that's a question that that's going to be answered not only in November, but in 2020, in 2022, and 2024.
How do you view the women who supported him and who continue to support him?
Well,
are they they're not, I guess they're angry at other women for opposing him?
Absolutely. One of the things I write about in my book is that women's political anger hasn't only been progressive throughout our history. Some of the most powerful campaigns led by angry women have been on behalf of fundamentally conservative, reactionary, right-wing, and white patriarchal politics. Phyllis Schlafly is an obvious example of this. She led a crusade through the late 1970s, basically against the second wave feminist movement, and
against the ERA,
and specifically against the ERA. And she won. And she was leading basically an army of women who were angered by the disruption to gendered power structures that had been precipitated by that 1970s second wave of American feminism. And in their anger at having gender roles questioned and altered, they actually dealt that movement a kind of symbolically killing blow in stopping the ratification of the ERA. Women are angry on both sides of the partisan aisle.
Who's been more successful over American history in channeling that anger into movements that end up wielding real tangible results.
Schlafly's campaign was powerful and it killed the ERA. On the other hand, it didn't undo all of the progress that the women's movement of the 1970s had made around workplace discrimination, around reproductive rights, a sexual revolution, Title IX, sexual harassment law. Schlafly couldn't undo all of that.
Well, can Donald Trump undo all of that?
He and the party that supports him. He is their vehicle to enact the kind of changes to the bolstering of a white patriarchal power system that they want to see. But I also think that he just says out loud what has been sort of prettied up in contemporary Republican politics. I mean, that's my view of the contemporary Republican Party, and its media outlets. And they've all been working toward this, right? This is the dream, the thing that Donald Trump is trying to do right now, which is cement a court that is going to put into place. And this gets to your question about, is he going to be able to undo progress? That's the idea. That is undoubtedly the idea that control of the Supreme Court means that the right will have, for a generation, the power to reverse the progress made by many of those social movements, many of which had been either led by or catalyzed by the anger of women. So they can undo affirmative action, reproductive rights, collective
affirmative action was
bargaining,
much undone in the 80s.
Right. A lot of this is the voting rights. A lot of this stuff has been eroded anyway. That's been, as I say, the big project of the right is to reverse the kinds of pieces of progress and mechanisms that got more people to more opportunity and something closer to equality in this country. If you can reverse those mechanisms, which the court has the power to do, then part of the idea is you can diminish or halt the growing power of people who are not necessarily white men.
Well, then, where do you fault progressive women for not harnessing their anger soon enough or early enough? Like, I was reading at one point, there was an article about how everything that the Republicans are doing is the result, and winning is the result of 40 years of strategic planning.
Yes.
And liberals kind of sat there because they had the court back then, they had Congress, they had the House for 40 years, and they figured they'd never lose, and bit by bit by bit, they have. I mean, they were the voice of the progressive movement of the 60s and 70s,
Right.
but they kind of did nothing in the 80s and 90s
Right.
and early 2000s
Right.
to keep that going.
Right. So for that, I don't blame just progressive women. I think that the left in this country, the Democratic Party, however you want to, define what passes for left politics in this country, I think hasn't done a lot of wise strategic work. I mean, the right built machines. It built its media mouthpiece. It focused on the court. It focused on reaching its coalition through the church and through a series of moral messengers. And the 1980s sort of joining of a moral majority with a right wing, created all kinds of communicative mechanisms that have served the party well. The Republicans have been incredibly strategic, and the Democrats have not been particularly strategic at all. And the left has never been good at understanding the role the court plays. It may be that the left is about to get really good at understanding the role that the court plays now that it's too late, and that the court is very likely to deal us blows that are going to last well beyond our lifetimes.
Do you think the Kavanaugh hearings and his nomination, did that galvanize more women on the left than who had already been galvanized by the Trump presidency? Or was it just, galvanizing the same people who were already galvanized?
Each new entry point into this mass of resistance to the imposition of further mechanisms of inequality, I think it's building on itself. It's not just that one is coming in and replacing the other. And each one, there were people drawn in after the Parkland shootings, There were people drawn in around who had not protested before during the family separation protests. I think that Kavanaugh has probably drawn some others. Another wave of revelations of how many women had experienced assault or harassment in their youth and sort of brought them into this conversation. I think that what we're watching is the renewability of rage in response to all kinds of circumstances. And the really crucial thing about it, from my perspective, is that we're getting a view of how all these things are linked, which has always been one of the challenges within a women's movement, because a women's movement is a majority movement. It is a mass movement. It is, by definition, a movement of people with competing interests, perspectives. There is inequality within that movement, racial and class inequality that has proved, divisive in many instances. And that's not getting any less divisive, but we're airing a lot of that division and a lot of the anger that is produced by the internal inequality, at the same time that we're understanding how many of these issues are women's issues. And I think that that's one of the most important things that's happening around us, is we're getting this civic education and a real view of how gun violence, school shootings are linked to police violence. It's linked to racism, to sexism, to assault. These things are all battles that are worth fighting together. And I think that is one of the things about this moment that has potential, even in the face of losing a court and the fact that the court is going to impose all of these limitations on the ability of the masses to protest.
Where do you see that we had 257, 56 women gain the nominations to run for federal office, which is a record number.
Every category, it's historic numbers of women on the ballot in November.
Is that do you think they'll win?
I don't know. I don't know.
But how do you harness that energy? I mean, a lot of politicians say you never win your first election. So how do you harness the energy that they had to run after the defeat of not winning?
Well, we have to see what happens. I think one of the things that has given me some hope on this front is watching some of the activists, right? So in the summer of 2017, around the Ossoff campaign, I went to Georgia, and there were all of these suburban women who'd sort of previously been politically apathetic, or at least quiet in their political convictions. After the 2016 election, they'd become really energized. Now, by the time I got there, there had already been one local candidate who'd run for a local office in this community that I was visiting who had lost. Now, she was running again. And in fact, the women who dedicated their lives to her were back in on other elections. And they swore to me the night that Ossoff lost. And these women described themselves as having been personally transformed by their entrance into political activism. And they spoke in terms of coming out of the closet and becoming new people. It was incredible to be around that kind of energy. And I worried very much in 2017. I was there the night that Ossoff lost. He lost by a thin margin, but he lost. And all these women who had given their every waking morning, night, weekend with full-time jobs and caring for children had been out, knocking doors, registering voters. And I thought, oh my God, what's going to happen now that this guy has lost and they're going to feel defeated? My friend who is there spoke of the women that we talked to then and said they are just as devoted as they have been. I think that there is an understanding that some of these are going to wind up in losses. And one of the points that it's on all of us to make is that shouldn't mean an end. That a single electoral defeat does not mean an end to a political career. Many of the politicians we've elected in our country's history have lost and lost and lost. Barack Obama, one of the most remarkable political winners in our history, he lost his first election. I mean, these things happen, and it doesn't speak to the end of a political career. Within, less than 10 years, he was the president of the United States. I think that these are, I think we need to get good about talking about it and be aware of a media message. Because my big nightmare about if those candidates lose is that the mainstream pundits are going to come along and say, well, we thought that this was going to be the year of the woman, but it turns out that women candidates actually just couldn't draw the voters, and sort of make it diagnostic. Well, it turns out that women aren't the big draw that we thought that they were.
But why wouldn't that be a test of that?
Well, I think it's a test of whether Democrats come out and vote. It's a test of turnout. I don't think it's a referendum on should women be the candidates. That's the thing that I'm pushing back against. That it is. It would be a referendum on enthusiasm on the left. Can the left actually, can it put out a slate of candidates that are going to draw voters? What is the feeling on the right? There are all kinds of things that the midterms are going to measure. Of course, also, there's concern about voter suppression. I mean, one of the things that's going to get measured, and we don't even know how to trace it in all cases, is the degree to which the mechanisms the right has already put in place to suppress the vote are going to have an impact. I mean, that's my great, great fear. This is what gerrymandering and suppressive measures are meant to do, and to skew the idea that we thought we had all these great candidates and we thought we had so much enthusiasm, but it turns out they all lost. Well, part of how we got to Donald Trump is the gutting of the Voting Rights Act by the Supreme Court. I mean, these are why they want to control these mechanisms, is because they can determine the ability or inability of the American population to decide who governs it.
Now, you say, women have gotten angry in the past and they've created a lot of progress in politics for women as a result. Also created women who were opposed to women's advancement, one might say, in society. But you say now, even to this day, women's anger is not accepted well. Why is that?
Well, I think that it's not just a quirk that women are told, and we are told this in personal ways and public ways, that if we express ourselves angrily, we will not be taken seriously. We will sound emotional. We will sound unhinged, infantile, theatrical. It will make us ugly. All the pictures, if you see, if you look at photographs of women on the left that are posted on right-wing sites, they are all women with their mouths wide open. There's a huge history of telling women to shut their mouths if they're going to open them in complaint. This goes back to a 16th century device called the brank that was actually a metal cage that they put on women's heads to keep their mouths shut. And it was meant for scolding wives. There's always been an incentive to keep women's mouths shut if when they open them they're going to say something dissenting. But I think that one of the things I argue in this book is that one of the reasons that women's anger is discouraged is because it's politically potent, because it is the stuff of political insurrection, and that if women open their mouths in anger, one of the things that they do is connect to other women who are angry. They become audible to each other, and then they can work together and they can organize. Whereas if they're encouraged to be silent and told that if they're angry, nobody's going to listen to them, so they might as well keep it in or disguise it as something else, and then that isolates them, and they think they're alone in that anger. So I think there's a political purpose to silencing women's anger. There's a reason that the irony is that for men, and for white men in particular, anger can be a tool in their arsenal. It makes them seem more rational, that they have something to be more passionate about.
That? I mean, the general reaction, for example, to Kavanaugh's anger in his Senate testimony was that it was not judicial.
In the aftermath, the Kavanaugh piece is very fascinating because it tells us something about how we are changing the conversation and questioning attitudes that I think have always been prevalent. I actually thought the night of his testimony, listening to the news, listening to pundits, the night of, I felt that the anger expressed by Brett Kavanaugh and by Lindsey Graham had worked for them. And I think that was the consensus that night. Well, that testimony was very compelling, but he came in and, he yelled and it was enough to persuade the other men. And in fact, it was. Flake had announced he was going to vote Kavanaugh through, right? It was enough, even in the face of compelling, deeply moving, and deeply credible testimony by Christine Blasey Ford. Kavanaugh's anger, which he could use to convey to the committee and to the American public that he had been wronged, because we kind of reflexively see the anger of a powerful white man telling us that he's been wronged as righteous and correct. That's the reflex. And I felt it was almost an animal Pavlovian reaction. The powerful man is sure enough of his correctness in this situation that he is going to yell about it. And God, there was this sort of sense like, well, okay, that worked. It was in the aftermath. It was with a 24 hours of consideration and conversation about it and people pointing out.
And legal scholars
that was crazy, right?
Right.
And it was actually.
Well, it was unprecedented.
It was unprecedented, and it was one of the first times in my memory, and I'm sure there are others, that I can recall some of the language that's usually applied to women's anger being applied to Brett Kavanaugh's display. So I did hear people say things like, he seemed unhinged. He was hysterical. And some of them were saying it to point out the double standards. But I think, right, he did seem that way. It did not convey a sort of correct assurance. He was over emotional. He was out of control.
Well, when he went back at Klobuchar and said, have you ever drunk and been blacked out, and not just once, but and he did that also with Blumenthal. And I, who've covered many Supreme Court hearings, just kept waiting for one of the senators to say, "I'm not trying for a Supreme Court position. Right. You're not even allowed to ask me any questions."
Well, he was also illustrating what. Going into the hearing, there was already a conversation about gender and power, right? There was already this conversation. We're not believing women. We're disrespecting women. We're privileging the story.
Well, you say that.
Well, there was not. I'm not alone. There were lots of protesters saying that. Right. There were lots of other commentators who've been saying that.
No, but I'm just saying there's another side that doesn't see it that way.
Right, but there was a framework out there, one of the views of what was at stake when you're in these hearings was the question of respect for women, the value of women's stories, his respect for women. And so when he goes in and he so clearly rears back against questioning of his own power, when he turned on Klobuchar and sort of made clear how much he resented the fact that she had the power to question him and turned it back on her when it was completely inappropriate for the setting, right? He's, as you say...
It's not done.
It's not done, and it's not the role. She's on the Judiciary Committee. He's being interviewed for the job, right? And you imagine going into a job interview and your prospective, the person who's interviewing you asks you about something and you say, well, what about you? Do you do that? It's just totally inappropriate. So upon consideration, again, I think this came with time, a couple of days, and the fact that Saturday Night Live mocked his anger. This is something new. There may be other examples of a time that a powerful white man's self-righteous indignation got publicly excoriated with time. But this is the example that looms largest right now in my mind. And I think that tells us that we actually are embarking on a more careful and thoughtful discussion about anger and when it's appropriate, when it's correct, from whom we accept it, and whether we accept it too easily from some people, and whether we don't hear it enough from others.
And how do you wrap it up in the book? Where are we going with, you say we may be making, fits and starts of progress toward respecting women's anger. Where does that get us? What do you do with that?
Well, one of the things we need to reckon with is that if we want to make the change change some of the inequities that women are so angry about, we have to sort of settle in and be prepared to stay angry for a long time, because there's an enormous amount of work to do, work that's probably going to last our lifetimes and into our children's and grandchildren's lifetimes. And we have to get better about not letting the power structures tell us to tamp down our anger, and to listening to the anger. We have to get better at listening to the anger of other women, taking it seriously, being curious about it. And then when we hear anger coming from people we agree with, to work on working together, to form coalitions, to do the work of organizing and political activism that is going to help us enact change over time.
All right. Thank you so much, author and writer Rebecca Traister. That's it for this edition. Please follow me on Twitter and visit our website, pbs.org/to the contrary. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, see you next week.
you.